the Advent that we are in is not just going back and waiting with them. It's actually going forward and waiting for the next coming of Christ to fully make all things new. So we live in a second Advent, if you will, where the word means coming. We're waiting for the fullness to come.
Hello, and welcome to the Shifting Culture podcast, in which we have conversations about the culture we create and the impact we can make. We long to see the body of Christ look like Jesus. I'm your host, Joshua Johnson. Today, we have a fascinating conversation about rediscovering the true meaning of Christmas. Our guest is AJ Sherrill, author of the book, Rediscovering Christmas. AJ takes us back 2,000 years to unpack the rich cultural context and deeper significance behind the Christmas story that we often miss in our modern celebrations. AJ explains how the birth of Jesus in Bethlehem, the house of bread, where he was laid in a feeding trough, is a profound symbol of him being the bread of life, come to nourish our deepest hungers. He also highlights the stories of characters like Zechariah and Anna, who models patience, longing, and faithful waiting for the Messiah's arrival. AJ challenges us to approach this Advent season not just as a nostalgic tradition, but as a time to cultivate our own longing for God's kingdom to come in fullness. He encourages us to create space in our hearts to encounter the God who searches for us, even as we search for him. This conversation invites us to rediscover the wonder and significance of Christmas in fresh ways. So join us and rediscover Christmas. Here's my conversation with AJ Sherrill. AJ, welcome to Shifting Culture. Really excited to have you on. Thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, Joshua, it's great to meet you, and I'm excited to chat today.
I'm really excited about your book, Rediscovering Christmas. I think it's really important for us to dive deep into the story and the context and what was going on and the characters and things that we have forgotten as we put up our Christmas trees, have Santa Claus come down the chimney, have nice presents on Christmas morning. But why are we celebrating? What is happening, and why was this first Advent really important? So I love really just to hear some of your story of how you got into this work of rediscovering Christmas and why you think it's important to illuminate the Christmas story and what was actually going on.
Yeah, I mean, you as a student and sort of a mission leader to the Middle and Near East, I think you probably understand it more than anybody, that when you walk the land, you realize that the land is the fifth gospel. It's like your blinders come off and you begin to see so much that you never noticed before in the two-dimensional reading of the text. And so I started that journey, maybe the better part of a decade ago. There was a guy a long time ago, he's still actually, I think, leading trips here and there, named Ray Vanderlaan. And he would take students into the context and teach, from that framework. And then his disciples became my apprentices. And so I would apprentice from some of his disciples. And when I went over there with them, just the whole new imagination of what it means to follow Jesus started to sort of connect with me. I'd been a pastor for 15 years up until that point. And so it's been a 10-year journey. I'm into 25 years of ministry, and only the last years have I begun to understand the depth of the richness of the culture and context by which the Bible, through all of the 1,000 years in which it came through, all of that came to be in a land. I think Scott McKnight, said it best, that the Bible wasn't written to us, but it was written for us. And when you discover that there's actually a real people and place and time that the Spirit was speaking to that is applicable for everybody, it just opens up a panoply of imagination of what is that? How do we connect the dots from that world to ours? I sort of operate with the presupposition that our culture today has more in common with the ancient world than it does the Renaissance or the Protestant Reformation. Not to say that stuff isn't meaningful or real or true, but to say that I think that the things that were happening in the Roman world, the pluralism, the sense of idolatry, and the stuff that was happening then connects deeply with our hearts today as to what it means to follow Jesus in our time.
Okay, well, I want to dive into that for just a bit. So, if our culture has more in common with antiquity of what was happening in the first century than the Renaissance, the Reformation, like that time and that era. So, our solutions for some of this pluralism, these problems that we have in our culture, are really stemming from like Renaissance era thinking and starting Enlightenment, and then moving forward. So do you think that now, as we've been searching and we're still anxious and lonely and afraid, and we don't know how to survive in this world very well, are the answers actually found back in this first century? And how do we start to uncover some of the things that we have lost because of the way our culture has actually started to shape us?
Yeah, I mean, I think God's writing a really long story. And when you realize that the realities that God has always been trying to bring to bear in his people are the same today as they've always been. That's just really connected with me. I think that's one of the differences I'm seeing in our time today that I wouldn't say is new, but is sort of resurfaced is like the longing for story. I think that's why we see Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter. These sorts of fantasy myths are so fruitful in our culture because people are longing to be a part of something bigger. And this idea of individual salvation through the Ordo Salutis, what are the 4 steps or 5 steps into becoming, having a sort of transactional sort of security for the future? I don't think that lands today like it once did. People are wanting to say, like, what does life mean today? What does formation look like now? What is the way of Jesus for my life in real time through all the things I'm experiencing? I think that's the gift that the ancient world and the land, to bring us back into is that imagination, and so I've certainly been really moved by that and a longing to stand on the shoulders of, not just those who came before me the last couple 100 years, but the last couple thousand years. What does it mean to hook back into those people and to follow the same Messiah that they were attempting to follow in a city like Ephesus, in a city like Caesarea Philippi, these sorts of places?
Has ministry changed for you since you have like dived into walking the land and being there? How have you communicated differently, or how have you shared different stories? What are you like drawing on more than you did in the past? How has
Yeah.
ministry shifted?
Such a good so I'll just put it through like a teaching ministry, which is my primary sort of bent. I teach context. I teach a lot of maps. It's kind of a running joke in our church. But it's not enough to give a history lesson, like, how do we connect the ancient world to the world today? So that's a lot of fun when you begin to understand, how the ancient context actually rolls up onto the shores of life on Monday. And people aren't used to that in the church. They're used to all sorts of different styles and many of them very good. But I would just say when you start to teach ancient context, people sit up a little bit, higher in their chair. And I think the reason for that is because a lot of Christians are bored. And when they start hearing what the world was like when Jesus walked it and what this parable actually means in its original hearing, what this would have felt like when Paul said this and the undertones of what he was really hinting at, I think people begin to say that the text is so much deeper than I ever knew. And so, that's what I'm seeing, and then I'm seeing a real hunger for people to say, "I wanna go there myself. I wanna walk the land. I wanna be on a pilgrimage. I don't wanna be on sort of like some transactional sort of, religion. I wanna feel like I'm walking the path." And so a lot of that is walking our path here wherever we are, but a lot of it too is taking some time and some resources to say, "I wanna walk the steps of Jesus and find out what it smelled like in these places, what it felt like in these places, what limestone feels like under my foot, what the dirt feels like in the Judean wilderness." That I think is really gripping people right now.
I've just seen an uptick of people that wanting to go on pilgrimage, people walking the Caminos de Santiago, people going, to Turkey and then looking at Colossae and Ephesus, and then people going into the Holy Lands and going on pilgrimage, but walking the path.
Mhm.
And I think it is an interesting thing that I've seen a huge uptick in people
Yeah.
starting to write books of what pilgrimage is. So then, what is that as a disciple of Jesus? How do you see our life as a disciple of Jesus as a pilgrimage? And how is that different than a transactional view of discipleship or doing church and being a Christian in the modern age?
Yeah, I think it's that view that spirituality is choices. It is the big moment, sure. It is the feel on the mountain, whatever. But more than anything, I think for people to come back to the ordinariness that, Paul would say this word, peripateo, you see all over the New Testament. And let's just take Ephesians, you see it 7 times, that Christ has done all this for us. He's walked the path we couldn't so that he could enable and fill us to the way that we can, over the course of time, begin to walk like him. And so I think it's the recovery of spirituality as a process of choices that over the course of time, God molds and shapes us into the form of Jesus. And God seems very comfortable with time rather than perfectionism and getting it right or behavioralism. Seems very interested in authenticity and naming where we mess up and taking responsibility for our own stuff and getting back on the path. And it seems to me like that's a very interesting spirituality for people today to show up and to say, like, I'm not even close to being there, but I'm in. I I'm committed to the journey and having grace on myself that God already has toward me, not just for some future destination, but for like what it means to show up again with my kids that I messed up with in my tone yesterday, or with my wife that I didn't respect yesterday, or with my colleagues or whatever. This idea of being fully into a process by which God is making us like him. I think that's interesting for people once again. And it doesn't leave you with a sense of existential boredom that you say a prayer when you're 13, you get on with your life, and hopefully you can cash in when you die. That just seems like a dying model in a world that's longing for justice, in a world that's longing for mercy, in a world that's longing for growth. And so that's where I find really interesting that the ancient world, I think, has to sort of give to us.
So we, as believers in Jesus, disciples of Jesus, are caught up in this story, and the story where Jesus has actually become incarnate and come to earth here in Bethlehem as a baby. Can you take us into that story that we're still caught up into, that Jesus is actually coming? What was happening in that place, in that time before Jesus was born, like right before? Set the scene. What was going on?
Wow, I love this question, Joshua. This is so good. So, Galatians talks about how in the fullness of time, God came. And I think we often think why did God come then when we have Twitter now? Right? Or we could have trapped him on video camera. It could have been solidified forever. But you see in the sort of amazing story that God's been writing over the fullness of time that Christ came in when the road system was being developed by Rome, when the language was being unified by the Greek, when the sort of economics and the socio sort of development of the expectation, even for the expectation of Messiah, as Rome was getting adjusted to Caesar Augustus being called Son of God. So all of these frameworks are coming to bear at the right time in which God could be birthed into the world. I think it's amazing how God so quickly flips the scripts on the empires of this world to leverage it for the kingdom work that he's doing. And that's just the amazing sort of sleight hand of God. It's ridiculously wise and beautiful. So in the fullness of time, Jesus comes and he's not just born. If we did a poll of how many people, and this is what a lot of this book, Rediscovering Christmas, is about, if we did a poll of how many people even knew what Bethlehem meant, I think we would be, as pastors, really despairing of we think it's just a random town. Maybe it was a prophetic text, but like the word itself means house of bread. And it's like, okay, who cares? Well, it's interesting because Jesus would call himself the bread of life. And the first place that he would be placed wasn't like some bed or like the text is very clear that he was placed in a feeding trough. So from the opening pages of the gospel, what you get is in the fullness of time, the bread of life was born in the house of bread and placed in a feeding trough called a manger that would nourish the hunger of every human heart. That is something. Like that's a story we need to tell. And that's one that Christians wake up and they say, whoa, maybe this God is much more strategic and capable and beautiful than I can ever imagine. What does that mean to trust that kind of God today with the challenges I'm facing? I think that's interesting.
What did it look like then, like when he was born and placed in that feeding trough? Was he in a little barn outside?
Yeah, yeah.
Or was he in He wasn't in the guest room because I was occupied, but he might have been in the a family room or a living room. And so take us, I just want to picture it. I think for a lot of people, we don't know how to picture the place and the area, and why it's important for us to get the picture, because we have lots of scenes of mangers, but it's probably wasn't like that.
Yeah, so this is a chapter on the innkeeper that actually doesn't exist. The word for innkeeper used in the early part of Luke is not the word Luke uses for the Good Samaritan parable, which he does mean innkeeper. So there's no inn, there's no Holiday Inn. I think we imagine the La Quinta. That somehow this family rocks up and there's an innkeeper and it's the sign says no vacancy and he's like, go down the road because there's a barn over there, there's a cave or whatever. And actually what it looks like then was a house, and over time you would build a guest house that attached to your house or was on top for guests, because hospitality was a primary value. I mean, you've been to the Middle East. Even today, hospitality is significant even for your enemies for a certain time. And so, to reimagine and to etch a sketch your Christmas pageant, imagine coming into a room and maybe there's a couple steps up into the living room, and then adjacent to that is a guest room. Well, there's a census going on, and so you can imagine other people have flocked home to Bethlehem, and that guest room is full. And so Mary and Joseph, this couple that are pregnant but are betrothed but not consummated yet, like, that would have been scandalous for them even to ask for hospitality from a family member, which it probably was associating with all sorts of sin. That this couple, we've not been invited to their consummation. They're just in Kiddushin, they're just betrothed, and so inviting them in, and that there's no room in the guest room because someone was probably occupying it. So there's this lower level that you enter into that was where the animals would be. And people are like, "Well, why would animals be in your house?" Well, in certain months, they provided heat. This was before the heating system of Linux or whatever your heater is in your house. And so they would have animals come in there. And that's why there would be a manger in the house, is because animals would need to feed. And so you can imagine, here's the King of Kings being born into a place where there's hospitality, but there's no extra room in the guest room. And so he's probably somewhere in the living quarters, and that they place him in the manger because that is where, it was available for him to lie. In that main room you would come into, that you would step up from the animal trough in that area, would be the kitchen, but also it's where you would sleep, and so it would all be in one room, basically. It was the first open floor plan was in the ancient world, so, the architects can sort of geek out on that, and the designers. But I think that's a very provocative sort of reimagination, because 'cause I'm used to it being a barn down the street, and the innkeeper was pointing, "Walk that way," and, "There's no vacancy here." The story is the exact opposite. It's actually about a guest house or a guest keeper, a house owner who, was willing to be hospitable despite scandal that could have been attached to his hospitality, and that this room would have been, one filled with family and some maybe friends and animals, and that this is the sort of environment in which Jesus, the bread of life, comes into the world, the lowest of low. It's remarkable. What do you think?
Well, I think well, because it's such a huge honor shame culture where any shame like that, which is a scandal, basically they want to cut it off
Yeah.
and hide it away and not be seen. And if that shame, that scandal actually comes in contact with you, you are also seen in the same way. So you're essentially cut off from that community because you're associating with scandal. This is why Jesus has all of these issues of like eating with sinners and tax collectors in his ministry, right? And so as he's eating with those people, they're thinking, oh, their sin and shame is actually attached to Jesus. But as you see with the story of the bleeding woman, even if she touches Jesus's robe, the power goes out of him. The shame doesn't come on him. He actually dispels all of the shame. And this is, I think, a beautiful picture of Jesus coming in incarnate into a place
Mm.
of scandal and shame. And as he comes as the bread of life, he actually then dispels that shame and brings that light into the darkness, into the world, into the scandal. And I
Wow.
I love the beautiful picture of what Jesus does, especially around shame in that context, in that area.
Yeah, I mean, what we're seeing is a great reversal, right? And we see that all through the story of the great reversals, even of Mary reversing the curses of Eve, and the one who seduced, the angel that seduced, we know Satan was an angel that seduced Eve into eating of the fruit. Here you have the reversal in another angel, um, also talking to Mary. And this angel, it's the reversal of that, and that she receives in the fruit of her womb the Messiah who would come and crush the head of the one who was the original tempter. And so you see these great reversals all over the scripture, that the coming of Jesus, there's so much connection. There's a chapter on Mary in this book where there's a connection between Genesis 1 and Genesis 3 with Luke 1 and what God is doing in the reversing of human history toward his love and his favor. And it's through Jesus, and it's absolutely stunning.
It's amazing. I just remember we were sharing this story out of Luke with a Syrian refugee, this Muslim woman. And as she heard the story in Luke, and so I'll just come into the character you just mentioned, the angel. But when the angel came into the shepherds, it says, I bring you good news and glad tidings for all people. She stopped us there and she said, is Jesus really for all people?
Mm.
I thought Jesus was just for you Christians, but is Jesus for all people? And we basically just said, yes, that's what the angel says. The angel says, yes, Jesus is for all people. And she said, well, if he's for all people, I love him. I want to follow him. And it was in that encounter with the shepherds, as she was a Bedouin woman herself and very acquainted as a shepherd, and actually then bringing it into that place of saying, the shepherds get to receive as well. And then I get to receive this good news that is actually for all people. And I think that is also a great reversal where the Jews are looking for a Messiah for them, right? And Jesus says, I'm actually a Messiah for all people. And that is a reversal. And I think it's still having this great, amazing impact today.
And, I think that gets back to the beginning of our conversation around walking the land, as you realize Jesus isn't American. You realize the story, though it includes us, it's not solely about us. It's so much bigger than we can ever imagine. And I think for those that are hungry, they recognize that. And there's a kind of awe and wonder that comes out of the significance of this ancient story that was for everybody. It's just beautiful. And I year after year in the season of Advent, return to the awe and wonder that, wait, even I'm included in this. So it's easy to have the posture of like, wow, even they're included in this, those people over there. And it's like, actually, we're the ends of the earth. Even we're included in this. And to resize ourselves into the magnitude of God's story, I think is really good medicine and really good for our formation.
All right, let's step back a little bit. We're entering into the season, this Advent season. Why is the importance for us to actually do some of this Advent work and wait for this coming King, this Jesus that is going to be incarnate with us? And then going through the seasons of Advent, what was happening back in the story for us so that we can posture ourselves into a place of actually joining in to the story of what was going on before Jesus was born.
Yeah, I'd say connect the season of Advent with your longings, like where there's ache in your life. That's the gift of Advent that leads into the day of Christmas, that leads into the tide of Christmas, that leads into the rest of the church calendar. What I mean by that is that Advent is the invitation to not suppress your doubt and your fears, your hardship, your struggle, your conflicts, unforgiveness. It's the season to check in with all that and to connect your heart, first of all, to go back with the ancients who were waiting for the Messiah to bring the great renewal that the world was waiting for. The Advent that we are in is not just going back and waiting with them. It's actually going forward and waiting for the next coming of Christ to fully make all things new. So we live in a second advent, if you will, where the word means coming. We're waiting for the fullness to come. But I think what happens is we don't learn to long, to wait, to ache. We wanna satisfy that with quick, cheap substitutes of whatever that might be, consumption, media, parties, staying busy, and so we don't actually tap into what the season is trying to do in us, which is to wait. There's a reason why long longing is about longing, right? There's like a sense of longing for something should require a kind of holy patience in us that's not willing to settle for something quick. Like, I'll put it in an example. It's like I have an 11-year-old and she'll come home after school, and let's imagine I love to cook. So let's imagine I'm making her favorite meal, but she's hungry and it's not gonna be ready for a couple hours. She is so tempted to feast on just what is not food, chips and junk and whatever, and by the time we get to dinner, she's just not hungry. And it's like that, I think, when it comes to this season, is we're not willing to wait for a true feast, and so we saturate ourselves with, all the things that the season brings, Aunt Sally's fruitcake to whatever, whatever, and all of a sudden, when the real meal is here, we're like, "Ah, I'm good. I'm gonna take a nap." And we miss the actual fullness of what it means to live into the story, and so that's what Advent is trying to do in us, and that's creative in us. That's not like, "Hey, here's the 5 things you have to do." It's to say, "How can I get in touch with my brokenness, and how can I turn that in a way where only God can solve this, and I'm not gonna seek cheap solutions to take the edge off?" I think that has a lot to do with our formation in Advent.
Take us into some of the characters that were in this longing and this
Yeah.
waiting for Jesus. Who are some of these people? What are we missing when we just know their names?
I'll talk about Zechariah briefly, and I'll talk about Anna briefly. Zechariah, this is a deeply religious man. The text actually tells us he's righteous. So Luke wants us to know from the very beginning that he doesn't have a child, but that's not connected with God's love for him and blessing of him. That's not connected to sort of any sort of thing he's done or left undone. It's just he hasn't had a child yet. And that creates a kind of shame and stigma in the community that they're wondering, like, what's up with Zechariah and Elizabeth? Like, they're barren. And he's like one of our most significant priests. I think he was probably somewhere connected to the Essenes, as a Sadducee, and so then he draw his number to be in the most incredible place where you light incense right next to the Holy of Holies, like once in a lifetime opportunity. And I think there's an irony that as he's watching the smoke go up, representing the prayers of the people, I think he's probably saying to himself, "This is what I would be saying to myself, like, God doesn't hear my prayers. I'm a little ticked off about that. He hears everyone else's prayers, but not mine." And I think that's why when the angel shows up, he's startled because he's not expecting God anymore in his life. That happens all the time, where God didn't fulfill something in my timeline, and it's like, I'm sorta going through the motions here at best, and then all of a sudden, he's silenced when the angel tells him what will happen to him. Now, I don't think the silence is a punishment, and here's the twist on the story. I think it's a gift. We look at that silence like God being like, "Hey, what's your problem? I'm gonna do this to you because you haven't been faithful." I think what God is saying is, "I want you to cultivate a deeper longing and waiting and hope in me. So I'm gonna create some silence in you so that you can expand that space in you that only can fill and watch what I do." And so Zechariah's the motif is just amazing on what it means to wait and to hope, even with things that are unresolved, because God will bring to pass his plan in due time. The other one is Anna. This is a post-birth narrative for Christmastide. I tend to think Anna, she's a widow in the temple. She's been cared by the temple system for, I don't know, 60 some odd years. She prays night and day. Widows were very vulnerable. And I think what's happened, I make this up. Pompey comes through in 60 years before Christ. Pompey comes through and basically takes over that part of Israel. I wonder if her husband was killed by Pompey's soldiers. And what she does is the math works out. What she does is goes straight to Jerusalem and is cared for by the system there. Um, I'm just curious if this is someone whose husband was taken, by the enemy, and instead of rejecting God, running from God, blocking God off from her life, she runs straight to where she believed God most dwelled, which was the temple, and she dedicates her life to praying for the advent of the Messiah. And so when she sees him, it's like, I I have actively been waiting for you and praying for you my whole life, and I can die now. I don't know. I wonder, I just think Anna is someone we don't pay a lot of attention to. She's kind of like a footnote in the story, and yet what an example of someone who faithfully, actively waited for the Messiah to come, and he did. So those sorts of narratives really challenge me in the Advent season.
I think that longing, that waiting has been so difficult in many people's lives. And hey, God doesn't hear my prayers. He's answering other prayers. Everybody else is having a baby. We can't get pregnant. I mean, my wife and I have been through that process as well of that longing. We have a son now, which is incredible. Both Zechariah, Anna, and a lot of these others received encounters that shifted everything for them. It
Mm,
changed everything. I don't really think anything really shifts unless there is an encounter with God.
mm,
Like a God is the one that actually creates the change, but it's an encounter. And this story, this Christmas story, is full of encounter, of like heaven meeting earth, of Jesus coming in, of angels, of like everybody speaking. It's just like the stars, the magi coming. Like it is like heavenly encounter all over the place that shift everything. What is the role of encounter? And then receiving that encounter for change in this story, in this Christmas story.
yeah, I've got this whole chapter on angels, and I mean, they're everywhere. In fact, they saturate all the scripture, and we don't see them. 'Em. They're sort of like the elephant in the room that we never name and talk about. There's this interesting thing called, Wi-Fi. I don't know if you've heard of it. Everyone's really into Wi-Fi. Everyone sort of dismisses the ethereal. I shouldn't say everybody. There's actually an uptick for spirituality. But, the first thing you do when you go visit a hotel is you ask what the Wi-Fi password is, right? Or a coffee shop. So we're sort of already primed that the invisible is a part of our everyday life. We can't see it. They said if you could see Wi-Fi, it would look like rainbow of light everywhere you go. And I just wonder if the divine is like that, that our world is actually charged with the divinity of God and God's emissaries everywhere, and we're just not aware of it. And that seems to be the case in the biblical text, and so why wouldn't that be the case now? Um, and so I think there's a role for that. Our role in that encounter, wherever they come, because 'cause they're often surprises. It's not like we can manufacture them or control God and tell God exactly how or when and where that needs to happen. What we can do is position ourselves to be available for that encounter, and even that sometimes God bursts through that wall and disrupts our lives to get our attention. But I find that there are ways that we can induce the kingdom of God in our life advancing, and a lot of that is creating hollow space in our day somewhere to be with God. That's not the only place God meets us, but there is a practice of cultivating. But I love that phrase, "Prepare him room." Conversations I'm having with myself through this Advent are, am I intentionally designing my day where I'm literally preparing him room in the deepest part of who I am, because that's where the Spirit of God dwells. And I want to attend to that and encounter that through silence, through stillness, through responding, through whatever words I use, through music, whatever that is. Like, I just want to intentionally feel like I'm on a journey of not just gliding through my season, but preparing him room to speak, to say something to me slowly over the course of my life. So those are things that I think I'm checking in with this Advent, lighting a candle in the corner every morning, preparing him room to speak to my heart, being in the Gospels, walking in a really specific way of holding certain prayers in my mind. These are ways in which I attempt to induce God's kingdom, trying to be attentive to who he is and what he's doing in the world.
there's two things I'm reflecting on as you're sharing that. One, I think that because we're caught up in a larger story, we often just think of the immediate moment. Like, I don't feel God right now, and I haven't felt him for 10 years. But if you go into the story of the Bible, you go to the story of Christmas, you go to the story of Advent, you go in the story of our lives, our lives are not flat, and they're not all mountaintops, they're not all valleys. We're ebbs and flows,
Hmm.
but God is consistent and faithful through all of it. I could name a handful of like God encounters that I've had in my life that have really shaped the trajectory of where I've been and what I've done, and the culture I've tried to cultivate in my life and the marriage that I've tried to have. But there are many times where I just don't feel that encounter,
Mhm.
or feel like the presence of God is with me.
Sure.
In those longer moments and longer years of despair and loneliness, how do we recognize the good shepherd is walking with us in the valley of the shadow of death, that we know that he is there even though we may not feel him?
Yeah, I mean, this is the deep stuff of the journey, right? You're gonna have those moments and seasons and years and decades for some. Mother Teresa would affirm that, and she's one of our spiritual heroes. In those moments in my life when I don't feel it, it's the invitation to trust it. I don't feel God, but I trust that God is. Um, and then, Ignatian spirituality, I think, has something to teach us about this, which teaches us to review the day and to say, where did I sense God's presence? Where did I sense God's absence? I To review what the day was like, I think a lot of my joy, a lot of my feeling God's presence comes from gratitude for what is happening in my life. No matter who you are and all the things we're going through, something good is happening somewhere in your life. It's always true. There's always something that you can find that is happening that is good, even in our hardest moments. And it's starting there. It's easy to start with what's not working in my life and to try to build out a spirituality from there, or a day from there, or worldview from there. But what if we started the day in this Advent with what is working, and that we built out from there, so that the joy that comes from realizing that God's hand is connected to whatever is working can sort of help speak into where things aren't working very well. And that I don't always feel like all of my life is deficit, that there actually is things that God is up to in your life that maybe we haven't connected the dots around his hand in our experience. And so that's a simple way, I think, to practically sort of cultivate joy and awareness of God's presence in our life.
Jesus is the bread of life. We get to feast on him. Oftentimes, I think we think that Jesus is the one that provides the bread that we feast on, instead of Jesus being the bread that we feast on. Um, what is that difference for us to know that he's the one we feast on? So it's not really the external circumstances of what I get, but who he is and how I could be with him.
I mean, I think, and again, we're in deeper modes of spiritual maturity here. I mean, we're talking about participating in his sufferings. We're talking about eating the meal he ate, drinking the cup he drank, not in replacement of him, but in participation with the spirituality of the cross, which is not a spirituality of immediacy. It's one in which I trust where the story's going. I know resurrection will. I mean, he prophesied. He said, "And I'll rise in 3 days." He put himself in the context of Jonah. However, he also said, "God, if I can get out of this crappy situation, I'm in." You know what I mean? I'm for that. Knowing that he was submitting to the Father's heart and about to walk through a shadow of death. And it's in that he tucked himself into feasting on the Father, and we feast on him. I think it's interesting, getting back to this bread motif. There is no culture in all of the world that doesn't have a form of bread, like a unique, creative form of bread. You take any culture in the world, the tortilla, the pita, the whatever, there is sourdough, there is bread everywhere in the world. And that Jesus would say, I am the bread of life. In every culture of the world, the integrity is preserved, but the creativity of the context in which Jesus can fit into is absolutely beautiful. And so, what does it look like to feast on him? I think, again, getting back to that sense that Jesus, this doesn't make sense. I don't like what I'm eating here in this circumstance. Nevertheless, I trust you and you're enough for me. Um, Even when that's a really hard pill to swallow, I think that is true nonetheless.
Can you take me into the practice of sacrificial giving, the practice of the Magi, and take us into that story? They're following the stars. What's going on? Illuminate this part of the story for us.
Yeah, I mean, how do you it's controversial. I think it's funny. We've tried to sanitize it and make it like, oh yeah, yeah, these astrological Zoroastrian, mystics are part of the story, right? I mean, the breadth in which God is bringing his salvation story to the world with shepherds and astrologers and just all of the people you wouldn't expect that would be there from the socioeconomic, cultural situation. It's amazing. It's right there from the very beginning of who Christ came for everybody. Um, I think the scene for us is here are these guys who had been giving their whole life to this craft, and all of a sudden their moment had come. And, in the book, in that chapter, I kind of clear up or try to clear up some of the contextual complexities around the East, but they're going West, and how does that work and all that. I think what's more interesting is that they've packed up their camels with the best of what they brought, but what's often not talked about is that despite the sacrificial gifts they gave, I think they received in Christ a greater gift, and they recognize that, and this is my sort of critique on the progressive edge of American Christianity right now. They didn't admire him, they adored him. They didn't say, "Wow, what a guru," and, "Jesus is a great teacher, a great guide, and we should this is the Lord, this is God, and we are going to bow down before that. We have finally found the one the world was waiting for." And they weren't insiders, they were outsiders that made that discovery. And I think there's something there about laying down their gift, no matter how much we give, God has already outgiven us in Jesus. It's beautiful. You actually can't it's not a transaction of like, "Okay, I'm gonna do this, okay." It's not like the equation is fair that they gave gold or frankincense so that and so God gives God's self, and so that's a fair transaction. It's not even remotely close. It's just what they got. And they're like, "Take it. Like, this is what I got. This is what I've brought, the best of my culture, this myrrh, which symbolizes your death," which is crazy from the very beginning. The very embalmment that he would have 33 years odd later is right there in the beginning, that this is how he actually becomes the gift to the world. I think that is, a mystery that, needs further pondering in the local church. Certainly expanding the scope of God's story for the people you like least or would affirm least. So there's a lot there to meditate on. I think that's really good medicine for us.
Thanks. Now you have to take me into a place where I have to love the people I don't like.
Yeah,
This is
man.
great.
Come on.
Uh,
Come
That's
on.
good. We need it, right?
Well,
We
and
need
here's
it.
what's weird. They go through the present king of Israel, who should have known. And you talk about creating space in your heart and preparing room for the kingdom. I mean, Herod was the anti-narrative of that, which that was a joy to write about because it's so much layered. We don't know a lot about Herod and the local church, but there's a lot we know about him from history that we need to learn that helps set the table of how am I becoming like Herod, who resists who resists opening my heart to Jesus, that wants to control and be my own Lord and King. Um, and just the awful regime that he led to in hopes of securing what he could never secure. Um, is just he's a tragic flaw in the story.
Well, give me a few things about Herod that we need to know that we don't talk about.
Best builder that probably ever existed. Built stuff like wild to even see his stones that are still at the temple. His palaces. If you've never been to Masada, make that a goal of your life to get to Masada. I mean, the most incredible, impressive political leader we've ever seen. Um, he could speak Greek, so he understood that world. He was, politically Roman, He had a sort of backdoor ethnic Judaism thing going on, was also connected to the tribe of Esau in his lineage, and I go through that and that weird story playing out all these years later. But I think there might have been, and this will be controversial to say, and I'm not sure if this is true. I think it might be somewhere. I think that some Jews were like, we hate this guy and he's taxing us to the hilt, but he's creating jobs and he's building our economy. And maybe if we back him, when he gets strong enough, he'll take over Rome and we won't be under their neck. We won't be under their boot anymore. I have to think that maybe there was a kind of a deal that they turned their blind eye to Herod's behavior because he was advancing their nation. So I think that there are things that even in today's world that would be a healthy sort of reflection of like, where am I making compromises for the sake of the economy? Or where am I making compromises for the sake of, whatever that might be? Jesus is king and he's not up for election, as my friend Scott Sauls would say. And what does it mean to revere and serve him first and most? So Herod is a figure that would be worth reading about, because I think there's a lot. I have probably more in common with Herod than I do Anna.
If Herod is the anti-story to the story of Christmas here, then what is this thing that is coming? What is this kingdom then? If it doesn't look like the power of the world to shape the economy or to bring about something a political arena in the world can bring about, what is this kingdom that Jesus is ushering in that looks different but is actually much more powerful and good and beautiful than anything that the world's economic or political systems can ever imagine or dream of?
Isn't that the question? I mean, how much time do we have here? I mean, certainly it's a world where it's beatitudinal. Blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are the merciful. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. It's always different than you think, and it's always better than you know. It is provision for the least of these, but it's not socialism. It's not government mandated. It's through the gift of transformation that the human spirit longs to see every heart filled, every mouth filled, every person loved. Like I think that is the work of the church, not to sort of outsource that to the government, to the state, but to say, how do we play a significant leader in that world of pure religion, of caring for orphans and widows? Like these are the things Jesus did. This is the sort of path that we're called to follow, is to be like him. And so there's a lot more we could say. We certainly couldn't say less, but there's a lot more we could say. I think the Beatitudes is always a really wonderful place to start of what the kingdom looks like. And I think it also looks like the overflow of the Holy Spirit. These fruits that we look at in Galatians, these aren't like abstractions. Like this is what the kingdom life looks like. It's growing in peacemaking. It's growing in joy. It's growing in self-control. Like when a community catches fire for that vision, they give a preview of what the kingdom that we are waiting for, this Advent that is to come, what it looks like. The question is, can we find people in a community that want to position themselves and surrender where that kind of life becomes possible? That's a hard thing to do.
Yeah, so good. Well, AJ, if people would go out and get your book, Rediscovering Christmas, what would your hope for them be? And how should we engage this book?
Yeah, my hope for them would be that throughout the course of Advent, and then most notably on Christmas Eve, that their hearts would adore the one who came for them. The one who we're trying to find is the one who came to find us. And so he's been searching for us much longer than we've been searching for him, and that they would be found. I would hope that you would find little moments of your day where you can sneak into a corner and pray. And those chapters are scripturally led. They're also visually led with a sketch that my friend Rick Sargent, here, a local artist in Charleston, did to sort of just guide your meditation, that you would kindle hope and that you would revel in the story because it includes you. And that would be the dream, is for people to know Jesus and to know that this story is so beautiful and is so ancient, but is so new, and God is waiting for you.
That's beautiful. Thank you. A couple quick questions I have at the end. One, if you go back to your 21-year-old self, what advice would you give, AJ?
Oh man, if I go back to my 21-year-old self, I would probably say slow down. God gave us the gift of time so that not everything needs to happen at once. So slow down and don't compare yourself. It's okay to be who you are.
That's such great advice for everybody. It's so good. It's so hard. I need to figure out, hey, when can I take the mask off and be who I am and who
Amen.
God created me to be? AJ, if anything you've been reading or watching lately you could recommend?
I have been reading my friend Trevor Hudson's new book. He's my spiritual director. He wrote a book on discernment. So if you're searching for a new sense of call in your life, of stepping into, he's a really great guide. I fail to remember the name of this title. It's new, but it's about
Discerning God's
spiritual
will.
discernment and stepping into your calling.
Discerning God's will. I
Yes.
should be interviewing Trevor shortly. We've been rescheduled a couple times, but he should be on the podcast soon. So
Yeah, he's
that'll
a
be good.
wonderful, wonderful guide into that.
Good. So I will definitely connect with him, make sure we're on. That's good. AJ, how can people go out, get your book, Rediscovering Christmas? Anything else you would like to point people to? How can they connect with you?
Yeah, AJ Sherrill, that's 2 R's, 2 L's, ajsherrill.org. If you want to correspond, I check email every day, and would love to keep the conversation going.
Great. Well, AJ, thank you for this conversation. Thank you that you actually put us into this place 2,000 years ago. What was going on in the story where Jesus came incarnate to us, to earth, which is mind-boggling, mind-blowing, incredible that God would do this for us and be with us in the middle of our longing, and that there is some hope along the way, that he ushers in this new life, that as he was in Bethlehem, the house of bread, he is the bread of life. He was placed in this feeding trough that we get to feast on Jesus, and that this bread motif is happening throughout Scripture and throughout our lives. And thank you that you bring us into this place of adoring Jesus, that we get to be ones that adore him. And so my hope and prayer for all of us as we celebrate Christmas, we actually get to adore the Savior, the King Jesus that has come for us. So thank you, AJ. It was a great conversation.
Yeah, grace and peace to you, Joshua.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode. If you want to see more episodes like this, go to patreon.com/shiftingculture and become a monthly patron of the show. You can help us produce more episodes so that we can see the body of Christ look more like Jesus. If you become a patron on patreon.com/shiftingculture, you will get early access to episodes. You will get episode guides. You will get bonus shows, hopefully, and more. So go to patreon.com/shiftingculture and become a monthly patron. Also, leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps us out and helps us find new listeners to the show. And just go and share this podcast with your friends, your family, your network, people that you think would enjoy it as well. Thank you again for listening to the show. I hope you have a great week.